The easiest way to measure a person's character is to watch how they treat someone they believe cannot answer back. The ballroom inside Whitestone Industries headquarters shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as more than 400 executives, investors, and community leaders gathered to celebrate the company's 50th anniversary. Soft piano music drifted through the enormous hall, while waiters moved carefully between tables dressed in white linen and polished silver. At the center of the stage stood Edward Whitestone, the white billionaire whose name had become synonymous with success across America. Cameras flashed as he smiled confidently at the audience, preparing to deliver the keynote speech that financial reporters would quote before the evening was over. Just a few feet away from the spotlight, almost invisible among the guests, Marcus Johnson knelt quietly beside a decorative light fixture that had suddenly stopped working. Wearing faded navy work pants, sturdy work boots, and an old maintenance shirt with his company badge stitched above the pocket, the 60-year-old black maintenance technician focused entirely on replacing a faulty electrical connector before the ceremony officially began. His weathered toolbox rested beside him, covered with scratches collected over 3 decades of honest work. Most people never noticed Marcus unless something stopped working. That never bothered him. He believed that when everything functioned properly, nobody needed to know who had quietly fixed it. Edward glanced toward the maintenance worker just as technicians announced that the lighting problem had been resolved. A few guests politely applauded without realizing who deserved the credit. Edward smiled, but his expression carried the confidence of someone who had spent years believing success belonged only to those standing under bright lights. Looking directly toward Marcus, he spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You know," he said with a casual laugh, "if you had dreamed a little bigger 30 years ago, you would not still be carrying that toolbox today." Several executives laughed softly. A few exchanged uncomfortable looks, but remained silent. Others simply turned back toward the stage, treating the remark as harmless conversation. Marcus slowly stood, gently closed the lid of his old toolbox, and offered the same respectful smile he had given everyone in the building for years. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply lowered his eyes and quietly said, "The lights are working now, sir. That is what matters." He began walking toward the service hallway, hoping the moment would disappear as quickly as it had arrived. Then a clear young voice echoed across the ballroom before he reached the door. "Did you just insult my father?" Every conversation stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the pianist removed his hands from the keys. A young black woman stepped out from the crowd near the entrance, holding nothing more than a small backpack and a folded college acceptance letter she had planned to show her father after his shift ended. Her name was Amara Johnson, and although she had inherited her father's calm eyes, there was unmistakable strength behind them. She walked steadily across the polished marble floor until she stood beside Marcus. Without raising her voice, without pointing a finger, and without showing anger, she looked directly at Edward Whitestone and asked again, "Did you just insult the man who spent 32 years helping build the company you are celebrating tonight?" The color slowly drained from several faces around the room. Nobody laughed anymore. The applause had vanished. Only the quiet hum of the ballroom lights, still glowing because Marcus had repaired them only moments earlier, remained between the billionaire and the daughter who refused to let her father's dignity be left in the shadows. Marcus Johnson quietly reached for the handle of his worn toolbox, hoping to leave before the silence surrounding his daughter turned into something heavier. He had spent more than 3 decades solving problems without becoming one, and that habit had shaped every part of his life. "Amara," he said gently, never taking his eyes off the polished marble floor, "it is all right. We should go." His voice carried no bitterness. It carried the steady patience of a man who had learned long ago that anger often cost more than dignity could recover. Amara glanced at her father and immediately recognized the familiar expression she had seen since childhood. Whenever life treated him unfairly, Marcus never fought to protect his pride. He protected his peace instead. That lesson had defined her entire upbringing. After her mother passed away when Amara was only 8 years old, Marcus became both father and mother without ever describing himself as a hero. Every weekday, he reported to Whitestone Industries before sunrise, inspecting electrical systems, repairing machinery, and responding to maintenance calls that nobody else wanted. In the evenings, he drove across town to a neighborhood hardware store, working a second job until nearly 10 o'clock so his daughter could attend better schools, buy the textbooks she needed, and dream about a future that stretched far beyond the apartment they rented on the south side of the city. Money was always carefully measured. New clothes waited until absolutely necessary. Vacations never happened. Yet every birthday, every report card, and every difficult conversation ended exactly the same way. Marcus would smile, place one rough hand gently on Amara's shoulder, and remind her, never let another person's opinion decide your value. Character is something nobody can give you, and nobody can take away. Those words stayed with her more faithfully than any lesson she learned inside a classroom. She remembered countless Saturday mornings sitting beside her father while he repaired broken lamps, old radios, or neighbors' appliances inside their tiny apartment. Marcus never rushed through the work. Every screw mattered. Every wire deserved patience. Sometimes customers offered extra money because they knew he had fixed problems others could not. More than once, he quietly refused the additional payment after learning the family had fallen behind on bills. "If we have enough," he would say with a warm smile. "Someone else probably needs it more." He never mentioned those moments again. To him, kindness was not something people announced. It was something they practiced when nobody was paying attention. Standing inside the grand ballroom, surrounded by luxury that felt worlds away from the home where she had been raised, Amara suddenly realized why hearing those careless words had hurt so deeply. Edward Whitestone had not merely joked about a toolbox. He had unknowingly dismissed every sacrifice hidden behind it. Every overnight shift, every missed holiday, every extra hour Marcus spent working so his daughter could receive the college acceptance letter folded carefully inside her backpack at that very moment. Marcus had never complained about the weight of that toolbox because he knew what it was carrying. It carried opportunity for his child. It carried promises he had quietly kept for 18 years. Around the ballroom, guests continued watching in complete silence, many seeing the maintenance worker for the first time rather than simply seeing the uniform he wore. Edward Whitestone remained standing beneath the bright stage lights, studying the young woman whose calm determination had unexpectedly transformed a passing remark into a question no amount of wealth could answer with a simple smile. Edward Whitestone did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stepped away from the podium, the polished wooden stage creaking softly beneath expensive Italian shoes that had never known the weight of factory floors or maintenance tunnels. For nearly 30 years, people had admired his confidence because it had built one of the country's most successful manufacturing companies. Newspapers called him visionary. Business schools studied his decisions. Investors trusted his instincts without hesitation. Somewhere along the journey, certainty had quietly become something even more dangerous. It became the belief that success could always be recognized by appearance. Edward had spent decades surrounded by executives in tailored suits, consultants carrying polished presentations, and advisors whose titles filled entire business cards. In his world, status often entered a room before character did. Looking across the ballroom now, he saw only an aging maintenance technician holding an old toolbox and a young woman refusing to let her father stand alone. He could not understand why one simple remark had transformed the atmosphere so completely. "Young lady," he finally said, keeping his voice measured. "I was making an observation, not an insult." His words sounded reasonable enough to several guests, and a few nodded quietly, eager for the uncomfortable moment to disappear. Edward continued, believing explanation would settle everything. "I have always encouraged people to pursue greater opportunities. There is nothing wrong with wanting more from life." Amara listened without interrupting. She noticed that he never once looked directly at her father while speaking. His eyes remained fixed on her, as though Marcus had already become part of the background again. Around the ballroom, executives shifted uneasily. The celebration had completely stalled. Crystal glasses remained untouched on linen-covered tables. Even the photographers had lowered their cameras, sensing that something far more important than another corporate photograph was unfolding before them. Marcus gently placed one hand on Amara's shoulder. "Please," he whispered, "he has guests waiting." She looked at her father and saw no anger in his eyes, only the familiar kindness that had carried him through countless difficult days. That kindness made the silence inside the ballroom feel even heavier. Edward folded his hands behind his back. "Success is built on ambition," he said. People make choices. Those choices determine where they end up. The sentence floated through the room before settling like cold air. Amara slowly looked around at the audience. Many faces showed uncertainty now rather than agreement. Some longtime employees quietly glanced toward Marcus with expressions of recognition and respect. Others seemed to realize they had passed him in hallways for years without ever asking his name. Edward noticed those shifting expressions, but misunderstood them. He believed they were simply uncomfortable with public confrontation. He still did not realize that many people in that ballroom already knew Marcus far better than he did. They knew the man who arrived before sunrise, stayed after midnight when emergencies happened, and never asked for applause when problems disappeared. Edward saw only a maintenance uniform. Everyone else was beginning to remember the man wearing it. The difference between those two visions was growing larger with every passing second. And although Edward had built an empire by reading markets, contracts, and balance sheets, he had completely failed to read the quiet respect slowly filling the room around the father he believed had accomplished too little. Amara took one slow step forward until she stood between her father and the stage, not as someone searching for an argument, but as someone refusing to let silence become agreement. The ballroom remained so still that the faint sound of the air conditioning drifted across the polished ceiling. She looked directly at Edward Whitestone, her voice calm enough that every person in the room leaned forward to hear it. "May I ask you one question, sir?" Edward nodded cautiously. "Of course." Amara glanced around the room before speaking again. "How many people here noticed the lights stopped working 5 minutes ago?" A few hands lifted halfway before slowly dropping again. "And how many noticed who fixed them?" This time nobody answered. The silence settled over the audience with surprising weight. Amara continued without changing her tone. "That is exactly how my father has lived for 32 years. People notice when something breaks. They rarely notice the person who quietly makes everything work again." Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside her. Recognition had never been something he wanted. He gently whispered, "That is enough, sweetheart." Amara smiled softly at him before looking back toward Edward. "No, Dad. Not because I want to embarrass anyone. Because I want people to understand." She turned toward the guests filling the ballroom. "My father never asked for applause. He never expected a standing ovation. He only believed that honest work deserved the same respect as expensive titles." Several longtime employees lowered their eyes. They remembered passing Marcus in hallways before dawn, carrying that same scratched toolbox from one building to another without ever slowing down. Edward folded his arms, still trying to maintain the confidence that had carried him through countless board meetings. "Hard work deserves respect," he replied, "but ambition changes lives." Amara nodded. "I agree." Her answer surprised him. Ambition matters, but ambition without respect becomes pride. She slowly raised the folded college acceptance letter she had been carrying since she entered the ballroom. "Do you know why my father still carries that toolbox?" Edward remained silent. "Because every overtime shift paid for another application fee. Every weekend repair helped buy another textbook. Every holiday he worked instead of celebrating helped me become the first person in our family accepted into college." She looked down at the letter for only a moment before carefully folding it again. "You saw an old toolbox. I see 18 years of sacrifices that built my future." Around the ballroom, expressions began changing one by one. Executives who had laughed only minutes earlier now avoided looking at Marcus altogether. A woman seated near the front quietly wiped moisture from the corner of her eye. The maintenance technician standing beside the service entrance removed his company cap and held it respectfully against his chest. Marcus looked overwhelmed by the attention, wishing almost desperately that everyone would stop looking at him. Edward noticed the shifting mood, but still searched for an explanation that would restore the comfortable certainty he had walked onto the stage with. Then Amara asked one final question, not with anger, but with quiet conviction that echoed through every corner of the ballroom. "Sir, if success is measured only by the title on someone's business card, then tell me this. Who has contributed more to this company tonight? The man who repaired the lights before anyone noticed they had failed, or the people who only noticed them after they were shining again?" No one answered. For the first time that evening, even Edward Whitestone found himself without a single word. The silence lingered for several long seconds before an unexpected sound broke through the ballroom. A chair scraped gently across the polished floor. Then another. An older man wearing a gray engineering jacket slowly stood near the back of the room. His silver employee badge reflected the chandelier light as he cleared his throat. "She is telling the truth," he said quietly. Every head turned toward him. "My name is Harold Bennett. I have worked here for 29 years, and if Marcus had not stayed after his shift one winter night 12 years ago, this building would have lost power before our largest production launch." Harold looked toward Marcus with deep respect. He never asked anyone to remember it. Before anyone could respond, a woman from the accounting department stood beside her table. "3 years ago, my husband became seriously ill," she said. "I was trying to pick up extra shifts, and Marcus quietly covered every emergency maintenance call I could not take. He never accepted a single dollar from me." Another employee slowly rose. Then another. A security supervisor removed his cap before speaking. "When my son was struggling in high school, Marcus spent every Saturday morning teaching him how to repair electrical equipment. That young man owns his own business today because somebody believed in him before anyone else did." The stories continued, not loudly, but with quiet certainty. A janitor described finding groceries outside her apartment door after losing work because of an injury. A machine operator remembered Marcus fixing his old truck in the company parking lot without charging a penny. A receptionist recalled that every Thanksgiving morning, Marcus arrived early with coffee and breakfast for employees who had volunteered to work holiday shifts. None of those people had ever been asked to speak. They simply could not remain silent anymore. Marcus lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable as every kind word filled the room. "Please," he said softly, almost embarrassed. "I only did what anyone should do." Harold smiled gently. "No, Marcus. You did what very few people actually choose to do." Edward Whitestone remained motionless near the stage. The celebration he had carefully planned was slipping further away, replaced by something he had never expected. One by one, ordinary employees were revealing a side of his company that had never appeared in annual reports, shareholder meetings, or financial statements. He glanced toward Daniel Brooks, the company's chief financial officer, who quietly avoided eye contact. It became painfully obvious that many members of senior leadership already knew Marcus by reputation. Edward was one of the few people who did not. He had spent years studying quarterly profits while overlooking the quiet character that had helped hold his company together. Marcus reached for Amara's arm once more. "Sweetheart," he whispered, "this has gone far enough." She looked at him with gentle eyes. "No, Dad. They deserve to know who you really are." Edward slowly walked down from the stage until only a few feet separated him from the old maintenance technician. For the first time that evening, he looked beyond the faded uniform. He noticed the deep lines on Marcus's hands, the worn leather handle of the toolbox polished smooth by decades of honest work, and the company badge whose edges had faded from years of faithful service. Suddenly, the scratched toolbox no longer looked ordinary. It looked like 32 years of quiet sacrifices that had built far more than electrical systems. Around the ballroom, nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. Every person seemed to sense that something even more important was about to surface, something capable of changing not only one man's reputation, but the way an entire company understood the meaning of success. No one moved. The grand ballroom that had echoed with laughter only minutes earlier now felt almost sacred beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. Marcus Johnson quietly rested both hands on the handle of his old toolbox, his weathered fingers fitting naturally into the grooves worn smooth by decades of use. He did not look proud. If anything, he looked as though he wished he could quietly disappear back into the maintenance hallway where nobody expected speeches from the man who fixed broken things. Amara stood beside him without saying another word. She had spoken because someone needed to defend his dignity, not because she wanted attention. Now the room itself was beginning to tell the story she had never planned. To explain, Edward Whitestone slowly lowered his eyes toward the toolbox resting beside Marcus's boots. Until that evening, it had been nothing more than another piece of equipment carried through the hallways by another employee whose name he had never taken the time to remember. Now every scratch across the faded metal seemed to represent another unseen morning, another emergency repair, another quiet sacrifice made while executives slept or celebrated victories made possible by work they never witnessed. The bright stage lights reflected softly against the worn company badge sewn onto Marcus's maintenance shirt. The embroidered letters had faded after thousands of washes, but the badge remained carefully stitched in exactly the same place, as though loyalty itself could be sewn into fabric. Edward found himself wondering how many times he had walked past this man without seeing him at all. Around the ballroom, longtime employees exchanged silent glances filled with shared memories. Nobody felt the need to add another story. The room had already heard enough to understand the kind of life Marcus had chosen to live. The pianist remained seated behind the grand piano, his hands resting quietly above the keys without playing a single note. Even the waitstaff stopped moving between tables, allowing the silence to settle naturally instead of rushing to fill it. Through the towering windows behind the stage, the last light of the evening sun slipped beneath the skyline, painting the glass with soft shades of gold and amber. The changing light seemed to slow time itself. Marcus noticed Edward staring at the toolbox and offered the smallest smile. "It is only a box of tools," he said gently. "The people inside this building have always mattered more than anything I carried." Those simple words landed far more heavily than any speech delivered from the stage that evening. Edward looked at Marcus for several long seconds before quietly asking, almost to himself, "How could someone work here for 32 years, and I never truly know who he was?" Nobody answered because the question was no longer meant for anyone else. It belonged entirely to him. Amara watched the billionaire's expression begin to change in a way she had not expected. The confidence that had once filled his posture had given way to reflection. For the first time that night, he was no longer looking at quarterly reports, corporate titles, or public recognition. He was looking at one quiet man whose greatest achievements had never appeared on a balance sheet. The ballroom remained wrapped in peaceful silence as the warm light continued fading beyond the windows, and in that stillness, before another single word was spoken, Edward Whitestone began to understand that the greatest failure of leadership is not overlooking extraordinary talent. It is overlooking extraordinary character simply because it wears ordinary clothes. The quiet was finally broken by the soft sound of heels crossing the marble floor. Sophia Carter, the company's human resources director, stepped forward carrying a thick navy personnel binder that looked as though it had spent years untouched inside an archive cabinet. She paused beside Edward Whitestone before opening it carefully. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "there is something you should probably see." Edward accepted the binder without taking his eyes off Marcus. The first page contained nothing unusual. Date of hire: maintenance technician. 32 years of continuous service. Perfect attendance awards. Safety certifications. Then he turned another page. His expression slowly changed. There were letters from department managers dating back nearly 3 decades. One described how Marcus remained inside the facility through a severe winter storm to restore emergency power before the morning shift arrived. Another explained that he had voluntarily trained dozens of apprentices after hours without requesting overtime. A handwritten note from a retired operations manager simply read, "If Marcus says the building is safe, I sleep better at night." Edward continued turning pages. Each document revealed another quiet decision Marcus had made without asking for recognition. Several bonus payments had been declined. Next to each refusal appeared the same handwritten explanation in Marcus's neat script. "Please transfer this amount to the Employee Hardship Fund." The dates stretched across years. Thousands of dollars quietly redirected to co-workers facing illness, unexpected expenses, or family emergencies. Edward stopped turning pages. He looked up slowly. He gave away every bonus. Sophia nodded. Every one that exceeded what he believed his family truly needed. She hesitated before adding one more sentence. Most recipients never knew where the money came from. The room fell silent once again. Daniel Brooks, the chief financial officer, quietly stepped closer. "There is one more document," he said. Sophia carefully removed a faded photograph tucked into the back of the file. It showed a much younger Marcus standing beside several employees in front of the original manufacturing building. Everyone in the picture was smiling except Marcus, who seemed almost embarrassed to be photographed at all. On the back of the picture someone had written, "Maintenance team after restoring operations during the transformer failure. Production resumed before sunrise." Daniel looked toward Edward. That incident prevented losses estimated in the millions. The board recognized the department, but Marcus asked that his name be removed from the ceremony because he said everyone had simply done their job. Edward stared at the photograph far longer than anyone expected. He searched his memory, trying to remember ever hearing that story. He could not. For years he had celebrated the company's growth without realizing how often that growth had depended on one man quietly choosing responsibility over recognition. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Please do not make this into something bigger than it was," he said with his usual gentle smile. Many people helped that night. Edward slowly closed the binder and looked directly at him. The confidence that once defined his expression had disappeared completely, replaced by something much rarer. Humility. He realized the daughter standing beside Marcus had not defended an ordinary maintenance worker. She had defended the moral foundation of a company he believed he understood. Around the ballroom, every employee waited without speaking. The celebration no longer belonged to the anniversary of a corporation. It had become something far more meaningful. It had become the moment when the truth finally stepped into the light after spending 32 years quietly walking the hallways unnoticed. Edward Whitestone drew a slow breath before stepping away from the stage completely. For the first time since the evening began, there was no distance between the billionaire and the maintenance technician he had judged only minutes earlier. The ballroom remained perfectly still as he stopped directly in front of Marcus Johnson. Hundreds of eyes followed every movement, yet Edward seemed unaware of anyone except the quiet man standing before him with one hand resting on an old toolbox. He spoke carefully, as though every word deserved far more thought than the careless remark that had started the evening. "Marcus," he said, using the man's first name for the first time, "I spent years believing I understood what built this company. Tonight I learned that I never took the time to understand the people who actually carried it." Marcus gently shook his head. "You do not owe me anything, sir. We all make mistakes." Edward looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "No, I owe you respect, and respect should never have needed a lesson to exist." He turned slowly toward the audience, then reached for the microphone resting on the podium. The room remained silent as his voice carried through the ballroom. "I asked all of you here tonight to celebrate 50 years of Whitestone Industries. I plan to speak about profits, expansion, and leadership. None of those words matter until I correct something far more important." He paused, looking across executives, investors, employees, and guests alike. "A few minutes ago, I judged a man by his uniform instead of his character. I spoke carelessly about someone whose integrity has strengthened this company longer than many of us have even worked here. I was wrong." No one interrupted. No one looked away. Edward continued. "Success is not measured only by the office we occupy. Sometimes it is measured by the doors we quietly unlock for others without asking anyone to notice." He lowered the microphone and walked back toward Marcus. Instead of offering a ceremonial handshake for the cameras, he extended both hands with genuine humility. Marcus accepted them without hesitation. There was no triumph in his expression, only the quiet grace that had guided him through every ordinary day of the last 32 years. Edward then turned toward Amara. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You did something very few people have the courage to do. You reminded me that leadership begins by listening, especially when the truth comes from someone the room has overlooked." Amara smiled softly. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone. I only wanted my father to be seen." Edward nodded. "And because of you, he finally is." He looked towards Sophia Carter. "Effective immediately, I want our Employee Excellence Award renamed in honor of Marcus Johnson, not because he sought recognition, but because future generations should understand what genuine service looks like." A wave of emotion quietly moved through the ballroom. Several long-time employees wiped away tears while others smiled through grateful silence. Marcus looked almost overwhelmed by the announcement. "Please," he said quietly, "there are many people here who deserve recognition." Edward smiled gently. "That is exactly why your name belongs on it. The people who deserve recognition the most are usually the ones who never ask for it." Under the warm glow of the chandeliers, the celebration finally resumed, but it no longer felt like a celebration of a corporation. It had become a celebration of humility, quiet character, and the simple courage of a daughter who refused to let the dignity of her father remain invisible. 6 months later, the first light of a spring morning spilled across the glass entrance of Whitestone Industries, turning the headquarters into a mirror of the bright sky above. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups, laptops, and lunch bags, greeting one another with the familiar rhythm of another ordinary workday. Yet something inside the main lobby had quietly changed. Near the center of the polished floor, beneath a wall displaying the company's history, stood a simple wooden platform, holding an old metal toolbox. The faded paint had not been restored. The scratches remained exactly where years of honest work had left them. Beside it rested a small bronze plaque engraved with only a few words. Marcus Johnson, 32 years of quiet service. Integrity builds what recognition cannot. People slowed their steps whenever they passed it. Some paused for only a second. Others stopped long enough to remember the man who had never asked anyone to remember him. Marcus himself had officially retired just 2 weeks earlier. The retirement ceremony had been intentionally small because that was exactly how he wanted it. There had been no grand speeches, no extravagant gifts, and no oversized photographs. Instead, employees from every department simply lined the hallway leading to the front entrance. As Marcus carried his familiar toolbox toward the door one final time, every person stood silently on both sides of the corridor. Engineers, accountants, security officers, receptionists, custodians, executives, and interns all remained on their feet until he reached the sunlight outside. Nobody had organized applause. Nobody had instructed them what to do. Respect had arrived naturally, just as Marcus had quietly arrived at work every morning for more than 3 decades. Across town, Amara had completed her first semester of college with outstanding grades. She still carried the same backpack and the same folded acceptance letter she had brought to the anniversary celebration months before. Whenever classmates asked what inspired her to study so hard, she never mentioned the ballroom or the confrontation. She simply smiled and said that the strongest people she had ever known taught her that real success begins long before anyone notices it. Edward Whitestone also changed in ways that could not be measured by quarterly reports. Before every board meeting, he walked through the lobby alone. He paused beside the old toolbox, reading the bronze plaque as though reminding himself of a lesson he never wanted to forget. New leadership training inside the company no longer began with financial charts or corporate strategy. It began with a simple question, displayed on the first presentation slide. Who are you overlooking today? The answer often led to conversations no balance sheet could ever reveal. One quiet afternoon, Marcus and Amara returned to the headquarters for a brief visit. Sunlight streamed through the lobby windows, warming the polished floor where the old toolbox rested beneath the bronze plaque. Marcus gently placed one weathered hand across the handle before looking at his daughter. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to prove. Edward watched from a respectful distance without interrupting the moment. The man who once believed greatness belonged only to those standing beneath the brightest lights now understood that the strongest foundations are almost always built by people working quietly beyond the spotlight. Father and daughter walked toward the front doors together, their shadows stretching across the marble as the afternoon breeze welcomed them outside. Behind them, the old toolbox remained exactly where it belonged, not as a symbol of ordinary work, but as a reminder that dignity never depends on wealth, titles, or applause. It lives in the quiet choices people make every single day, even when no one is watching. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply making sure a good person's worth is finally seen.